I just wanted to start with the conversation about democracy because it's an important big question application to many of the systems work that we have been um, discussing over the last few weeks. Okay, so first of all, I ask you a question. Feel free to reflect internally, or even better, if you can actually use the chat and share a bit of your perspectives. We talk about the history of development and how the goals of development have been changing over time, right? Like from growth mainly, right? Like to agency and freedom in Zen, right? Like, and um, this mix of objectives, like much more diversified that you can see nowadays, especially during this century in the last 20, 25 years. Now, I ask you a question. If we agree, or we consider at least, that development is or should be the expansion of agency, is a country with high GDP, but with low citizen agency influence, truly developed? And this is an important question because so many times we have been willing to sacrifice collectively things for different populations, parts of a country, our own life even, right? Like under the rhetoric, very well fundamented in the end in numbers, right? Like that the growth, economic growth, GDP growth is an important thing. It's a condition for everything else. Because, right, and this is very visual and very compelling, right? Like instead of like distributing the cake, we need to also enlarge the cake so everybody has more opportunities. And this is an important point, right? Like I'm an economist. I grew up in that world and I was trained in that world, and I recognize the incredible importance of GDP. Thing is, like there are ways to grow and there are different ways to grow, right? Like and that doesn't mean the fact that you grow doesn't mean that you have to leave unattended large numbers of your own population, or that you cannot prepare for the particular consequences of that choice of growth that you have taken will lead to. Let me ask you another question, okay? We talked about governance a couple of weeks. Governance as a system, as a steering, governance as an operating system in which all these different actors, norms, rules, informal or formal interact, right? These relationships of power. So have you ever considered or thought if yourself or the people that you work for, right, that your work is for, right, like that, do they have like, or do they live in an operating system of governance that allow you to be an owner, not only just a user? So then let's start. Welcome back. In our session on rethinking development, we have discussed over the time how the industry often treats people as problems to be solved, or about poverty to be reduced in our space. Today, we apply that same critique to the issue of democracy. For the last, say, 30 years, global development has followed a path of institutional mimicry. We have talked about mimicry weeks ago, right? Like, and how this is about basically trying to copy paste models that have been considered or are widely considered as appropriate, best practices, if you want, particular structures, very much focusing on the form rather than on the function, right? For institutions to be organized, right? Like for services to be delivered, and so on. And we call this institutional mimicry. We talk about the OECD and how, for example, if a country wants to access the OECD or be considered, right, like they typically have to follow a number of rules. There's a whole list of things that you're supposed to do on how to organize, because those are best practices that have been seen working elsewhere. That is not a bad thing. It's an important starting point to have. But part of the problem that we were discussing is that it ends up being very tempted to focus on the form rather on the function. Are those particular institutional settings working for the goals that we are pursuing beyond obviously the accession to OECD or not? So we have exported parliaments and courts over like centuries also as different models. The European model, right, in the colonies. In a way, we have exported that the same way that you will think in an operating system that we are exporting software packages. Okay. But as the World Development Report of 2017, another very important document from the World Bank that I strongly recommend, makes clear, institutions are hollow if they do not manage power. When we look at democracy as a finite game, people stop trusting in it because they see it as a winner-take-all contest for capture of an administration. So everything is centered in the way that we look at democracy when we look at it as a finite game around, for example, elections. And then we give our vote, and then basically we do not have, or most countries do not have, check mechanisms to control what is happening in between. Then we have 4 years later, 5 years later, or 6 years later, depending on where do you live, right? Like you may have, because sometimes you don't, have an opportunity for a change, for correcting. Okay, so here we are. We say reclaiming development, so then let's reclaim democracy. So we're going to use here a perspective on democracy that is not defined by the ballot box, but is defined by the idea of unleashing agency, very much connected with the idea of agency and freedom, right, that we have discussed in the past. Okay? So let me again, maybe you work on the space of democracy, maybe you disagree with this perspective on democracy. Let me just use this as a working definition. And we can, of course, judge it, we can discuss it, we can see if it even makes sense. Okay? But it's going to open a whole set of different opportunities because in the same way that the way that we approach development and the tools for development that we have at our disposal are different if we define our ultimate goal as growth versus agency, right? In democracy, if we define it like not only or beyond the ballot box, but about agency and freedom, right? Like then the tools that we can use to improve the way that we actually do or have democracy nowadays are different too. It's exactly the same framework in that sense. All right. So let me use that as a working definition. Okay. So then the same way that there are development problems that we have talked about, including climate and all, that are infinite games, right? Like in democracy too, we're going to propose that is very much an infinite game that doesn't end with a particular election or every 4 years with an electoral process. If now democracy is an infinite game, right? Like that means that it's a continuous pursuit where trust is built over time because citizens have a proof of stake. We're going to talk a little bit about this concept in a moment. They aren't just voting, they are influencing the system because they have skin in the game. This is what called actually, if we go back to the conversation about governance, right? Like this demands a shift. This demands a shift from the idea of transactional governance to an idea of relational governance. Something key to consider. Now, let me start by moving here like a few things, okay? So this slide basically tries to describe what I have been talking about so far, about the limits of institutional mimicry. Oh, and welcome, Leah. How's it going? Please feel free also to just manage or look at the chat box, please, whenever you have a chance. Oh, wait, did you? Okay, super. Let me just continue. And please interrupt me at any time, Leah, where you may need to communicate about what you're seeing on the chat box. I will make also, and I stop in a little bit just to comment on additional questions. We already had a couple of questions coming in. This is about like the way that we have been looking at development. Here is a reference to the World Development Report 2017. Okay. This is a comparison. Every time that we talk about how is it that people in development are starting to look at these issues, I typically offer this kind of a slide where you see a few characteristics of, like, for lack of a better name, the old way, the old operating system in this case, right? Again, compared to the new operating system, right? Like, how is it that we are looking at democracy in particular as a finite game compared to an infinite game? And again, I suggest that if you are unfamiliar with the terms, that you go back to that conversation, which was probably in class 3 or 4, when we talk a bit about finite and infinite games. Okay. So proof of stake, when they are influencing the system because they have a skin in the game. Also, what's the point of this? That if you have more at stake on a particular issue being defined, right? Like, do you have the mechanisms for your voice to be considered more in the conversation?
Mario, just so you know, the
Yes.
presentation cannot be seen anymore. I'm happy to share it on your behalf, but just let me know.
Okay. Okay, I don't know why. Perfect. Um, do you want me to share? I'm gonna share it again. I guess that way I don't have to ask you for going through the slides. I guess I have sent a request. Maybe when you enter, you took over as the
Yeah,
manager
I
of the
think
meeting.
so. Go ahead.
Okay. So let me just do this. Okay. Okay. Can you see that map of the world? Just confirming.
Yes.
Perfecto. All right. Let me just go back. No, no, no. See, I'm ruining it because I'm ruining the surprise. All these different cases, beautiful cases that I wanted to bring today and that you're gonna have in your inbox very soon. Okay. So these are just characteristics, right, in which we are comparing things between the when we consider democracy a finite or an infinite game. And the idea of proof of stake, right, like, is that precisely your vote, the opinion, the perspective that you bring has more value if you have more to lose or to potentially win in a particular conversation. Example, right? Like, if, and this makes sense, right? Like, if somebody's gonna come and extract mineral from your land or your ancestral land, right? Like, or wants to do that, it makes sense that your voice and your perspective has more weight in the conversation, right? Like, than just somebody that sits in the capital city of that country, maybe comfortably, and just expects the benefits of that activity. That I do not think that is that controversial, but the way that it plays out and it actually happens, it varies. It also has to do with how this works effectively, because in the end, you may have actually on paper a mechanism like consulta previa, like consultation and like free consultation, for example, for a mining project to start in your land or in your area. But how it is managed in terms of like the information given, the response to comments and concerns, right? Like, many times becomes just a checklist. You have the report, right? Like, you have enough people supporting it, right? Like saying, "No, most people support it. Let's just move in for this." And then you forget that that is going to come to get you eventually, right? Like, there's going to be people protesting, there's going to be people that are unhappy with the way that the process was managed, and so now how is it that you have enough people actually owning that idea so you can move confidently with it instead of just trying to convince people or just give them pieces of information, which in the end weakens trust. This is very much at the core of the conversation that we had about territorial development and multi-stakeholder engagement a few weeks ago when I was in Lima. Okay. So what we're proposing here for an analysis, right, is a blueprint that has to do or that picks up on the things that we have been talking about over the last few weeks, right? Over the last few weeks, we talk about thinking about these development challenges very much from the point of view of building a strategy for a strategy defined as positioning, but aiming for durability. And for that, we said that we need to not only identify the key players, right? Like what is their stake in the system, what is the particular status that they gain of this during the status quo, right? Like who's going to change the status, like when we change the system or the law or a particular project is implemented, right? And understanding also who can block the effort, right? And why. Who is it that you may be able to bring as an ally or as an ally over time? So understanding that system of relationships between the different players allows you to strategize, to think about what will be the ideal or a viable coalition that of people that may actually own the process of change. And then what you discuss with that coalition are the steps, the actions, the concrete things that we can do over time and that complement each other. So very much a perspective on how is it that we build a set of interventions that are owned by different people, but coordinated by different people in the system, right? That have a better chance to respond to system constraints. And maybe over time, not only waiting for that Overton window to appear, but actually build the conditions for that Overton window to actually happen. Okay? So I have divided it here just for simplification, right, in 5 basic steps. Okay? First of all is redefining the problem. Is the problem actually what you were originally put in front of? Right? Like, so maybe the way that we're defining the problem, right, it's limiting us and limiting our options. So this has to do in the end with being able to shift the focus from treating the symptoms like corruption, right, like to addressing more root causes, like the exclusion of agency, for example. Okay. So before I continue with this blueprint, let me ask you a question and please feel free to comment on the chat box. Okay. Why do you think that most reform projects fail as soon as the funding or the leader leaves? Why are we so dependent, right, on a particular type of funding, or if the person leading the process leaves, which can happen? There may be an election and maybe the person pushing for it is no longer there. Maybe somebody that is working from an NGO or a university or even from the government, right, like is leaves for a different job or is fired, right, for political pressure. And we talk about the case of the Minister of Education in Peru many years ago, right? Like how that reform went. Have you ever like thought or considered about this? Why a reform that may be a very good idea, that may be very well based, anchored, rooted in good evidence, fails when the funding or the leader leaves? And
Everyone here has the ability to unmute, so if you, they can also answer the question by unmuting if they'd like.
awesome. Great. Thank you for reminding us, Leah. So again, if anybody would like to participate, let me know or raise your hand, right? Like I'm happy to stop there for a moment. Let me just quickly go to the chat box, right? Like Anurada, for example, was suggesting like projects ideas fail because it impacts the sustainability aspects that prima facie the project is built upon. Yes, I mean, like this has to do with sustainability aspects, yes. But the point is like, are you able with others, not by yourself? Because the truth is like most of the times, right? Like your position is only gonna help, is only gonna allow you to focus on one part of the problem. Okay? But have you thought about what you can do to favor that sustainability? Right? Like what happens if you have to go, even for personal, for family reasons, right? Like, and you have been building important work. Um, and that has to do very much also with the idea of not only the team that you have around you and that supports you in your particular organization or project, right? But also the alliances that you have built. Because as we have seen, most development interventions, right, like are not a direct line, right, where you just implement an intervention and you get the desired result, period. Not only that doesn't work like that, maybe not in the magnitude also that you were expecting, right? Where you are even have to face the question of like, was this worth the money, right, invested? The cost benefit analysis, but also the question of sustainability. Like, is this actually going to be sustained between the particular amount of funding that I have, the current project that is out there? And most of the times when we have to answer these questions for proposals that we send to donors and all, look at them and or look at yourself too, right? And think about it. And I'm telling you this from personal experience. It's always where I find the most dissatisfying part of my proposals. Don't tell anybody, but it's true. Um, Adequate capacity mission mode strategies are not built, isn't built objectively within the system or establishments, stakeholders beyond, oh, pardon, I'm so sorry. I missed that part of the comment. I was just trying to read.
Brendan, thanks so much for this comment. Would you maybe want to unmute and share a little bit more?
Oh, that will be helpful, Brandon, because your comment looks very good, but is long. If you don't mind, if you can.
Sure. Thanks, Mario. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, just a reflection that, many of our project approaches have been locked into kind of more linear and kind of rigid thinking, A plus B equals C. And what we're really talking about here is understanding and navigating and hopefully shifting systems that hold a challenge or hold a problem in place. So I think that's more iterative, as you're suggesting, from I think this kind of cycle. It's iteration around relationships, it's iteration around understanding systems, it's iteration around finding kind of entry points and leverage points to start to shift systems, both kind of formally, resources, policies, institutions, but also informally, relationships, power dynamics, kind of inclusiveness, mental models. So yeah, I think the major challenge for development has been trying to kind of adapt project modalities to systemic realities, and a lot of times that has failed, or we've had to really work at the edges and margins of kind of the restrictions that I think project modalities impose upon us. So hopefully, I think with the shifts that are happening in the sector, the knowledge, the lessons from practitioners, figuring out how this actually works on the ground, is pushing us towards a different paradigm. And I think hopefully that's reflected in this course and in other conversations happening around the globe right now.
And I will say thank you so much, Brandon, for that. Like, it is happening, right? Like, and you see it every day, and you see it. I mean, like, if you have like in your LinkedIn feed, all right. Most people have LinkedIn probably like in this group, maybe not. Sorry if I am over assuming here, right? Like, but there are all these conversations, these posts, these things that are coming out, and we like many of the comments or we put a heart on it, right? Like, or brilliant, right? Like the little light, and then That's it. Wow, these people are doing like that, are having great ideas. And we tend to consider many of the people that are looking at this as either visionaries or people that at least are trying to approach things differently. But the problem is that the system, the operating system, has conditioned us very much to work alone and to compete with each other. So basically, we send a proposal for funding, which now is more scarce and is harder to get, of course. And we are expected from our particular position of the program that we are leading to actually propose a compelling, convincing pathway to sustainability, to actually convince the donor that you are checking all the boxes and covering all the risks attached to the program. And the truth is that even though your section, that section on your proposal may be very good, right? Like making it happen or for sustainability to happen does not depend on you. As big as the program may be, talking programs of $100,000 that completely overpromise in that sense, because that is the incentive. You have to say that you will be able to control it, right? Or even with programs or potential funding of millions, yeah, for very complex issues. We do not know how to work together, how to work in a coalition. Very much that was the reason why we started the Governance Action Hub, right? Like, and very much why is it that we are doing this course? We're trying to find the others, other people that will be interested in exploring practical ways, right, of doing development different. Very much focused on coalition building, right? Like going beyond what many of these visionaries are telling us that we definitely need to look into, right? Into how can we actually make it happen for very concrete things. I don't have the answers or the direct answer. I'm not one of those visionaries. But I hope that with some of you also, we can work on ways to actually make it happen. And we will probably fail in the beginning, word of warning, but we need to try. We need to try something different. So let me just, to complement the idea of the strategic blueprint right here, right? Like we have talked about strategy in development as positioning. Okay, so then if our objective is to make a democracy that is more focused on agency, that is more durable also, right? Like we do need a strategy for positioning. We aren't just looking for a policy win. We're looking to change the relationships in the system. That is much more complex, right? So we're going to be talking about practical ways of approaching this. Now, the first thing that is required is problem redefinition. Okay? So we're saying the problem isn't just corruption, it's exclusion of agency. That reframing is already going to condition the way that we approach the problem through different tools that may be ideally evidence informed. Okay? Then we need to map our unlikely allies. Look, I'm not even emphasizing here, right? Like talk to the people that you know that think like you. Talk to the NGOs that work with you in the past or that you know because you went with the other director to college together. Okay? Like, but look actively for the unlikely allies, maybe in the private sector, right? Like when a law was pushed in the Philippines or was trying to be pushed, right? Like to facilitate the takeover of land in this race for nickel, right? Like because of the metal of energy transition, strategic mineral and all, like an unlikely ally in like taking a break and actually reconsider things or taking some time for it were a soda company and a beer company. Why? Because they need water. They need good water, fresh water, and the risk actually of contamination was very large. Maybe, like as based on discussions also with NGOs in Mindanao, maybe in the beginning they didn't think that that would be the key ally, for example, in that conversation. So when you look for unlikely allies, you need to think who within the state wants, state or like the private sector and all, wants to do things better. Who on the street is ready to collaborate? We must identify also the blockers, those who profit from a closed system. Our goal is to make the cost of exclusion higher than the cost of collaboration. Think about it, right? Like, how do we make the cost of exclusion higher than the cost of collaboration? That itself, we can have like a whole course on it. We are building coalitions not for a project cycle. And this is very hard to overcome because we have been trained based on project cycles. But how is it that we move to build those coalitions, those alliances, for the long-term health of the operating system that is democracy? Okay, so this may sound abstract. So let me actually move into a few examples. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start just with one, right? Like, for example, this is a way to look at citizens' assemblies. And this may be a concept that you may be familiar or more or less familiar to. We're going to put a few resources if you want to learn a bit more about citizen assemblies. But I wanted to start with citizen assemblies because it's something that I have been looking very close by, right? In trying to understand how is it that it could work in different contexts. How is it that you put people at the center of the decision process, right? Like without people going crazy or just saying like you're going to destroy the country. But of course, but people need some education, right? Like to be able to decide on policies and all. There are all these discussions about the idea of citizens' assembly, of like giving the power or at least a limited power to decide on a particular topic, right? To people. Of course, there are risks, but if the system is not working right now, shouldn't we look for options? Now, if you think about it, and we hope to in one of these practitioner dialogues that we're going to be organizing in the coming weeks, to have one person that was deeply ingrained and was part of the process of citizens' assemblies in Ireland. Okay, so if you follow in a few weeks, you're going to have a chance actually to interact with her. So in the case following this blueprint for the idea of citizens' assemblies, right? Like the way that the blueprint will work is in this way, right? Like how there was a redefinition of a national debate, right? From a political gridlock over abortion climate to change the framing of the conversation into one of agency gap of people that have more at stake. Okay? So in terms of looking for unlikely allies, right? Like if you follow the story about the Citizens Assembly in Ireland, you can identify how they actually align 99 randomly selected citizens, scientists, and parliamentary committees. Like when you are looking at the potential blockers, right? Like you actually use random citizen selection to structurally block interest groups from buying influence. It is hard to buy influence if you don't know in advance who is going to be part of the conversation, right? It's a longer process. So you put in a different framework those that you know that are going to be against having even a conversation. A citizen assembly does not guarantee that a conversation is going to go on one direction or the other, but is going to prevent from the capture of the conversation or simply the blockage of even having the conversation. So then in terms of actions, right, like the deliberations around the problem of abortion or climate, which were the two main topics that they were discussing in Ireland, right, like were legally linked to a constitutional referendum. Then the process got real teeth. And then in terms of evolution, right, like this actually provided politicians with some political cover to act, right? Like, so those that actually wanted to focus on, but they maybe have been afraid to actually support the effort because of backlash that may happen, right? Like maybe because of the following election and all. So then those that were open, but now they perceive less of a political risk, right, can act and then permanently unlock a paralyzed national system. Of course, this is an stylized interpretation of what happened, right? It's not the full story. And certainly, because that's the whole point that I'm trying to make here, right? The story does not end there. Maybe this was successful in passing one or two particular ideas or topics, or at least having a more open conversation for it. But does that mean that those that oppose it are you going to say, well, we lost and we just stay here and we're not going to do anything about it? No, probably there's going to be pushback. Pushback can be happen in the short term, or it may happen in the long term. How does the sayings goes? Like, revenge is a plate best served cold. Sometimes, right, like that pushback takes years, but it may undo a whole line of reform because people that see their interests affected have a very strong incentive to organize and push back in different ways. Okay, so the story has not ended certainly in Ireland. And please, I'm going to mention other cases from around the world. None of these are intended to be best practices or like star stories of success that you should follow. Okay? If you have learned one thing about me and how I deliver this class, like, is that I am against the concept of easy solutions, of recipes. And I'm sure that most of you, if not all, are too. Okay? So let's take many of these cases with a grain of salt, and I will invite you that following the resources that we're providing or doing your own search, right? Try to find more about these cases, right? And the nitty-gritty of them. I'm going to try to stylize them, not to sell you something, but just to try to apply the blueprint. I'm not selling them as stories of success. Big warning here. Okay. So we're going to talk about the citizens' assemblies in Ireland, but I want to provide a couple of examples of how this has worked in different places around the world, right? Because you may say, oh, well, this worked in Ireland, right? Like, oh, it's Europe, it's a different reality. Okay. How people are looking at this different way of considering, of reframing the operating system in other parts of the world. Okay. So I pick only a few examples. I was trying to have one from what the World Bank calls the MENA region, one from Asia, one from Sub-Saharan Africa, another one from Latin America. Okay, so let's go into this. Do we have? Okay, I'm gonna just put this as a framework, okay? And we're dividing the conversation into what is the catalyst for that particular experience, what is the innovation that was tested or tried, and what is or was the proof of stake. Okay, so let me start with Chile. All right. So we have the case of what was called in Chile the estallido social a few years ago. Okay. Maybe one person that is looking right now at this or will look at this lesson later is from Chile, and they may have a different interpretation actually of what happened, and that's perfectly fine because the story doesn't end where I'm going to stop. Okay. But what happened was that in 2019, had like a relatively small hike in subway fares in Santiago triggered a national explosion, national protest. Why? Because it's not about the specific hike in the subway fare. It's in the end what it reflected, what was behind it, what was the operating system. The operating system, based on the 1980 Constitution, offered no way for people to influence their lives beyond being mainly consumers, right? Recipients. It was very much a democracy. In Chile, democracy has been recognized for many years in Latin America as one success case compared to many others, right? Like, especially like after Pinochet was finally voted out in a referendum, but also before of that, very successful economically speaking. No? So in very, very much a democracy without agency still. Now, the innovation that again didn't necessarily solve the problem, but was an attempt precisely to look at it, well, maybe we need a new operating system. So Chile launched a process to rewrite its constitution using a body of citizens that was based around the principles of gender parity and that included indigenous seats. Now, what can we get of lesson about the process in Chile? That even though the first draft of that constitution was rejected, right, the game changed, the process changed, right? Like the state was not about lower fares, but about the definition of the state. And it actually, the process proved, if anything, regardless if you think that this constitution is good, is bad, was a success as a process or not, or what you think of the previous president, okay? It did prove that agency, once unleashed, cannot be easily put back in the box. The genie is out of the bottle. I don't know what is going to happen in Chile. They actually voted somebody that is more on the right on the spectrum currently, based on a platform of security in particular. But that's the decision that most of the people in Chile did and across the board, because they decided that that is a key issue and that this candidate actually maybe had a better platform for them. So that is the case of Chile. Let me quickly move to a case from India, right? And we're going to finish with these cases, and then I'll have some time also for questions. But just want to give you a sense of how this works in real life. Okay, how can you use this framework to look at what has happened, but most importantly, to consider strategies in the future. Okay, so in Kerala, right, like the idea of people's planning in India. So in 96, and anybody from India, I know that Anurag is connected, tell me if I'm interpreting it wrong, okay? So we'll have some time for the questions too, but maybe I'll ask you again, anybody from India or from Kenya, right, like to tell me how to complement this information, all right? This is Stellaris. So it was 96, okay? And you have the state of Kerala, right, like facing a crisis of development, stagnant development. But instead of launching a top-down fix, right, like they launched what was called the People's Plan. So the idea or the key point of the People's Plan was to move 40% of the state budget directly to village councils. I'm not telling you that everybody should do that. I'm not telling you that I was successful all the time. I'm sure that there are stories of like many of these villages councils not working properly for different reasons. Okay? But what was attempted here is that to give more decision power at the more local level. Okay? So this will go to village councils. So then what happened as a consequence is that you have millions of citizens attending these Gram Sabas to decide where clinics or roads will go. Okay? Again, I'm sure that there are a lot of stories there, and maybe I don't know if Anu or somebody else knows a bit more about this. Okay? But the point is that this made the whole idea of proof of stake literal. Okay? Because there was more control of the money for a larger amount of people. They also became defenders of that process. Right? It transformed in many ways the idea of citizens as beneficiaries into planners. Again, in some places it's going to work better than in others. These processes don't stop there. There may be capture of the process over time. We have an old saying in Spanish, echa la ley, echa la trampa. I'm sure that there is a better translation in English, but roughly speaking, right, like is that you may have the law, the new norm, like that is stabilized, and then people find the way around it. And that's very much the definition of an infinite game. It doesn't stop there. Okay, so we can have a whole analysis about what happened with people's planning, right, over time, and how can it be and should be improved in any case. The third case that I wanted to mention is Kenya. Okay, and this had to do with the concept of devolution and the county revolution. Put yourself in 2007. There was all this post-election violence. In Kenya, was realizing that an hyper-centralized presidency was a finite game that caused conflict. They didn't call it, of course, a finite game. Okay, I'm framing it here. Then what you had is like the Constitution of 2010, right? Like created 47 counties, each with its own budget and a mandate for public participation. So there you move from the idea of entry points for agency. Okay, you move the actual entry points for agency. It is imperfect, right? But it did allow local coalitions to solve local problems. And what you're doing by doing that, you are making democracy more of a local pursuit rather than a distant process based in Nairobi. Okay? And then I'm going to mention a last case, which I guess important. And actually, I learned very much about this when I was looking for a specific case in MENA, right? And this is the reform of islands of trust in Tunisia, right? Like the municipal islands of trust. And this happened after the Arab Spring, right? With the national transition in Tunisia that was struggling. But at the local level, right, like there was actually a new law that gave municipalities autonomy for the first time. So there were cities like Sfax that experimenting for the first time with participatory budgeting, right? Like where neighbors decided on neighborhood improvements. Now, participatory budgeting has a lot of problems. In Peru, for example, it is in law at the local level, but it doesn't work well because of capture over time. But my point is that you change the conversation. There is a consequence of all this. The game is not the same. Your baseline is not the same. The lesson of this is that these islands of agency, right, kept the democratic habit alive even when the national operating system was under threat. Sometimes you have to look beyond the national level. That is precisely what we're doing in Peru too, in the work that we're doing. Okay, so hopefully you have found these stories, if not compelling, because in the end I'm not trying to convince you here, right? Like just indicative, right, of the kind of work that can happen. So what are the lessons that I want to leave you with in this class, right? How is it that I go back to my regular job and I use this information, okay? First of all, I'm going to introduce the concept or the idea of islands of agency. There was an old paper, I guess it's not old, almost 20 years, 2008, 2007 paper by Leonard. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I recommend it. It's based on cases in Kenya. And the paper of Leonard introduced, to me at least, the concept of islands of efficiency, right? Like, or islands of good governance. Where you may have a system that does not work, but you may have specific locations, like specific geographic areas or constituencies, or you may have specific parts of a system, specific agencies or areas within a line ministry and all, that seem to work really well. So, how do I apply this? Okay, into the concept of islands of agency. First of all, right, like, sorry, just wanted to show you this. How do we apply this idea of islands of energy? Have you ever thought about this idea of like, how is it that my own work can be over time an island of energy? What kind of workflow you can build starting tomorrow around an island of, or the concept of island of energy? And how is it that you are able to promote or facilitate the scale up of those islands of energy, right, by almost infection? Okay. So in this class, we have basically done a bit of a travel from historical failures of institutional mimicry to high stake. These are high stake experiments in Chile, in Kerala, in Ireland, right, in Tunisia. But there is a question, right? Like, what do we do when that system feels too big to change? Because the first reaction will be paralysis, right? Like, all right, I work in a small NGO in India, right, in a completely different part of the country. I mean, like, what do I do? So this is where we start moving from the idea of a macro strategy, right, where we will be able to change the system, right, or hopefully or ideally, to micro tactics, right? In many of the contexts where we work, in fact, right, like the national operating system is under extreme stress. It may be close, it may be authoritarian, right? It may be paralyzed by inertia, technocratic inertia. However, the case of Tunisia's municipalities or Kerala's village councils, right, like what they show is that we do not have to wait for the hero of the top, the person that is just going to save the day. Okay, we can build islands or pockets of the system where rules of the infinite game are applied, testing grounds, right? Like where we are approaching the problem not as a finite problem, but as an infinite game, where trust is built locally, where agency is unleashed. Now, these islands become a proof of concept for the rest of the system. So just to tell you a bit of the work that we're doing in Peru is going exactly in that direction. We started with 2 regions because the national system simply is in a complete disarray. But we found the opportunity to connect and the willingness for different actors to connect around territorial development in those 2 regions. Is perfect? It's not perfect, but at least we can see people that before could not sit on the same table unless it was to negotiate something. Okay? Now, these islands of agency, right, become proof of concept, I was saying, because they prove that a different way of doing things, of relating, is possible. Is possible. Now, how do you know if you are building an island of agency or just another project? Okay? For this, what I propose you, and you're going to have in your material once you go to the website too, I'm proposing an agency audit, right? Like, and this will be if you want an agency audit checklist, even though I always talk about checklists in a negative way. Okay. Every time that you design a policy, a program, or a coalition, okay, you probably should run it through 4 filters: proof of stake, direction of agency, relational governance, and a check on what is the game that you're playing. Okay? So, proof of stake. Does the participant have a tangible skin in the game? Are they risking and gaining something real or just attending a workshop for a per diem or for a certificate? What is the direction of agency? Right? Like, does the intervention make users more dependent on your organization, or does it give them the tools to navigate the system without you? Okay? I hope that our relationship continues beyond this course and that you interacting with these topics or these ways of doing things does not depend on us existing. Hopefully, the tools that you get from this course also help you navigate the system without us, because we're essentially going to go away eventually. Okay? We're not a toll booth. I guess that is a very graphic way of looking at this. Okay? We shouldn't be toll booths. You shouldn't be toll booths. There is the idea of relational governance, right? Like, if we are actually buying cooperation through incentives, we're making it transactional, or are we investing in a long-term relationship where we share the risk of failure, which is the definition of relational? Okay. Remember, in the end, we have been talking about durability, strategies for durability. Durability is a byproduct of relationships. Very important, right? I'm sure that you are not here like after several sessions, especially those of you that have followed us for several sessions, just for the certificate. The certificate, hopefully, I mean, like, it's something that you feel proud of, right? Like, but the truth is, like, we're not, I don't know, Harvard or MIT or Stanford, right? Like, in that sense, the certificate is valuable as much as, like, you are able to apply the concepts in there. And that's why we focus so much in practice here. And then the fourth point, right, is the idea of the infinite game filter, right? So maybe a good question to ask is like, if the funding for this project disappeared tomorrow, will the stakeholders still find a way to keep the game going? If the answer is no, you are playing a finite game. So here's the thing, just as an example, again, for the work that we have been doing in Peru, right? Like we work with these groups in Cajamarca and in Moquegua, right? Like, but in the short term, we have found more resources to continue the work and making it grow in Cajamarca and also to start the work in a third region. Right now, we don't have dedicated funding for one of our regions in Moquegua. Yet, the group that we formed there, they continue to interact because they have found something that they didn't have before. And they keep the conversations alive. And then there's going to be a local election later this year. And they continue the interaction. And we're not managing stuff there because sadly, we don't have more resources dedicated for that work. I don't know how much it's going to last. Maybe after the next election, it goes away. I hope also that I'm able to find additional resources for that work in Moquegua because it was extremely costly and personally taxing to build that, right, for them. But then now they own it too. And now it's no longer only our responsibility to find the funding, but also for them to find ways to continue the work by themselves. I hope that this has been helpful for you in terms of examples, framing for a conversation around democracy. Look that I'm talking about territorial development, climate, mining, etc., because the point here is that democracy goes much more beyond the periods of elections. It's precisely how is that people are engaged with processes in between elections too. A final reflection, okay? I invoke you to think about democracy not as a destination, but rather as a constant pursuit. This is where the concept of infinite game comes in, right? Where the goal is simply to keep the game going. You want democracy to keep going. So you're going to have to keep fighting for it over time because there's always going to be somebody who's going to try to undermine it. Assume it. Internal, sometimes external too. As you go back to your organizations, whether it's the World Bank or a local NGO or a government ministry, right? Like in the end, I hope that you start seeing also your job as the one of an architect of agency. This is why we wanted to have this session, because in this framing of democracy and the framing that we have been building together on development, the two concepts are interlinked. Can you have development without a democracy? Can you have a democracy that lasts without development? It's not just one way or the other. So if I have to leave you with a suggestion, is that when you are planning your next project or you are looking at how to tackle the issues that you are currently working on, right, that you're putting your heart out on, like do not just build institutions. You should focus on building relationships, not for networking, but for results. Okay? You can do it for networking too. So the point is like do not just focus on reducing poverty only, right? Like, but how is it that the work that you're doing or the work that others are doing that complements yours, right, is actually or potentially can unleash the power of people to define their own development. This is how we reclaim democracy, right? And that is how we build a system that people will actually fight for. I have nothing else to say. So, Leah, please, if there are questions or comments that have been coming on the chat, please let me know. I'll be happy to address those.
No, but I did post in the chat when you were going through the examples from India and Tunisia, as a couple in Chile. If, I think over the years, like history, it may not repeat, but it does rhyme. There are going to be similarities across contexts, even if in the details it's not identical. So I was really curious to hear from others in the course if any of the examples you gave resonated in their contexts and why. Like, were there similar challenges, but maybe they solved it in a different way, or did they come to a same solution from a different challenge? So I did pose that question to the chat. However, I'm also just curious to hear if anyone has any general reflections, please. I'd love to hear it. Please go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Thanks, Leah. Am I audible?
Yes, Anu, we can hear you. We can hear you. And
Okay.
I'll go back to the comment from Laura also, unless Laura want to mention later. But thank you. Thank you, Anna. Please proceed.
It's a very good session. Thanks, Mario, for enlightening. And I liked your last sentence, very much a valuable one on reclaiming democracy. Most governance practitioners will value this in depth. And I just wanted to reflect from Leah's comments. I wanted to share inputs on the Kerala example. Thanks to her share that. It's one of the oldest um, relevant, a decade, more than a couple of aspects that it has impinged upon. In India, I mean, the process of, the financial devolutions to a local government, that to a rural, um, I think Kerala has always been a very pioneering state for many years. It comes from the southernmost tip of the Indian subcontinent. And in India, I think the constitution, which is enforced since 1950, clearly states the 73rd constitutional amendment and the 74th constitutional amendment talks about devolution of powers, finances, and the working of the urban local government and rural local government. So this is principally a reflection of that. So, the democracy is very strong, especially the deliberative form of democracy, where people directly take part in the local institutions and are part of the planning and processes and decision making primarily, more than just being a part as an audience or being a part of an autocracy. So that's a very classic example from where the trajectory has moved a lot upwards. And it has been the nucleus of a lot of developments. And until now, there's been a lot of reforms, not called in the name of reforms, but the real kind of reforms. Say, results-based budgeting has been one, performance-based budgeting is another. Now, a couple of years before or 3 years, there are a few local bodies which are also thinking about, which have also brought in reforms in the sense climate-based budgeting, which is important because climate is not a subject of the government alone. It involves a lot of people and involvement of a lot of other stakeholders. So at the local governments level and also the multi-level governance, like starting from the India has got a federal structure. So there is a local government at the closest to the people. Then there is a state government subnational entity, and there is a federal government. How participation happens at these three levels would prima facie define as to how democratic aspects are being strengthened. So this is what I wanted to reflect from your example that you've given. But I think you yourself have spoken about social audit and social accountability in India in the past session. So I thought I'll skip that. Those are very phenomenal exercises that India has a law, and there are few subnational entities, the state entities, which have even social audit offices within the government, where some of the projects are audited by local people, the government project based budgets. So these are forms where they kind of reflect and they also monitor few aspects of it. But planning processes have always involved people. But to sum up, I just want to share this mm, thought from the hybrid governance or the new public governance. Resilience is very important in a democracy, and also that projects and programs should never fail. That should start from the leadership, be resonated within the system. And also the system should reform itself in from its the way it envisions to say, it's not about whether sustainable development goals to exist. I think institutional reforms can always be there. But I think getting the multi stakeholder involvement into projects and programs like the private sector and also philanthropy and also getting civil society in place will strengthen the resilience model from what it is to what it could be. Like rather than putting the accountability one day on the government. I say this because I did the missionary of government study for several countries when I was a mid-career professional. And it was very interesting to know that a lot of fractured system-based things that are related to government functioning, especially when reforms do seem to produce a lot of efficiency improvements, but not being consistent beyond. Involves a lot of interventions that could be innovative also, but also to say, a lot of things could happen by systems being reformed from the leadership model to also to bringing in different partnerships. And I call it alternative model of development because development is not something, it's not an experiment. It is basically a very sustained vision that the resilience takes care that there is no failure or there is no adverse impact on whosoever is the beneficiary of the program. The beneficiary could even be the government, right? So I think the combined network governance models. I think few countries have also refined. I don't want to just be speaking about only about India. I think Norway is a classic example of alternative models of government. I think Switzerland also has done a lot of impactful, where a lot of vetoes can be done by the people themselves, right? And also being part of the new developments in a digital democracy, which is happening now. I think citizens need not be just waiting to be part of local institutions. They can always be part of any program or project. I think introducing a sort of incentivized KPIs for any individual to be supporting a process and in a more effective way, I think it can bring in some kind of innovation into the system. So the the kind of you also mentioned about the practitioners agency audit that you were talking about. I think this is very useful, especially the social accountability model that you spoke about last time. I
Mhm.
was part of the initiative where we established a South Asia accountability system with the World Bank, probably in mid 2000s, I think 2007 or 8, I don't remember. It was
Mhm.
not a country level initiative. So it is not about a country, it's not about a government, it's not about politics. I think it's about making sure that these systems would work and it will kind of bring in people, not by force, just because they suffer, but bring in people to play a very active role. Maybe that kind of multi-level governance, which bring in an interplay of different players who are not just champions of subjects, but who could take the energy forward. I think probably SDGs, beyond SDGs, this could be a component, bringing in systems-based reform, bringing in active participation, maybe a reform model of democracy, not being called just democracy, but in a different terminology itself.
Mhm.
I think this would enable, things that we do not see this as an impediment in any donor funded or bilateral funded or a government change kind of a scenario. So I just want to reflect upon this, and I think you dealt with it in depth. That I don't want to add anything else, a new scenario to be discussed. That's why I did not interrupt in between. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And again, right, like we record this. This is, for example, Anurag, one rabbit hole that I will be very happy to go deeper into, right? Like, because there's so much richness in what you are sharing. Also, I'm gonna go to one of the initial points that you made, right? Like, what is
Thank
the
you.
history behind like many of these experiences in India, for example, right? And that is where you start realizing that a lot of these things, right, like that are keep happening, that happen in that moment, right? When we talk about Kerala, that happen after, and the ones that happened before, are in the end different building blocks. The experience in Kerala, right, which I'm sure there are other experiences that maybe are not that documented, that me sitting here outside Washington, D.C., right, like I do not know much of. Um, The one at the World Bank that have worked a lot on these issues too is Biju Rao, who recently retired, for example, right? Like, and I remember reading avidly a lot of the material that he had produced over the years. And a lot of very interesting lessons there. But in the end, when you look at these processes precisely, not only about one particular experience or one particular project, then you start realizing how these are building blocks. A lot of the experience in Kerala will not have been possible even without some minimal regulation or legislation that will allow for it to happen. And for that legislation to happen, people had to fight for something, for these things in the past, previously. So sometimes we forget that we are also resting on what others before us have been doing over time with much sacrifice. And this should be like a challenge to us. It should humble us, but it also should be a reminder that even though sometimes you may be frustrated because a donor is not looking at the work that you are doing enough, or maybe they are not funding it enough, right? Like, or you feel, or you may feel that the work of your life is not being appreciated or used enough, or is not gaining visibility enough, right? Like, that over time, what you do is also valuable. It is creating value and is also, even though it may not solve your problem in the short term, I'm not trying to minimize that. This is a big problem, right? Like, you can actually be building, contributing to the building blocks to change over time, right? And for whoever is going to pick the baton from you over time. At least that is a way in which I choose to see also the work. I don't know if what we're doing right now at the Hub or the work that I did 15 years ago in Pakistan, right? Like, is actually stuff that resonates. I don't even know if it made sense or if it had a direct consequence. I would love to think so, right? Like, but I do know that we tried our best, that we did a lot, that we tested things, we tested people and people's perspectives too. We made people questioning things, right? And we're trying in the end to contribute to a debate that may not be solved even in our lifetimes, as frustrating as it may seem, right? Like, what you do, what all of you are doing in the world in development, it matters. It is important and it can be transcendent. The point is, like, how do we give it also the strength, the visibility, the outreach that at least increases that perspective and that potential for that work to actually inspire change over the years. And that is the same in Ireland. It just didn't happen because there were a couple of illuminated people that decided that this will work. That Overton window, we talk about Overton windows here, right? Like, did not happen just because it was built over time. In some cases, maybe even in generations, over generations. There's an excellent book that I forget right now that speaks how the men reaching the moon was a process that started 150 years before through books, research, and all. And what kept happening is, the interesting thing about that book is how people started to find in an era without internet, right? Like, find the books or the writings of other people before them, and they built their own work on that work. And then progressively, not steadily, not in a direct line, right? Like, that led to the achievement of a whole generation, right? A whole era. And it was a whole process with minor or like a zillion, million, I don't know, less of the capacity of computers that we have today in even our cell phones. Just think about it. And Laura, I completely agree with you, right? Like, there is a big issue with incentives. Even these things, the things that we're discussing here, you're going to hear them, right? Directly or indirectly in many donor forums, in any conversation. I'm sure that many of the things that we are raising right here are going to be discussed next week at school. Okay? And then nothing will happen. And partially nothing happens or very little happens because Like the way that we're used to build our projects, the way that we're used to work is so ingrained because we have been trained to think that that is the way that it's supposed to be. But new ideas eventually keep carving, changing, keep being contaminated, right? Like, and then you're going to have more, maybe one at first, maybe then three, maybe then five, maybe first with the small donors, not with the large ones and all, right? Like, where you're going to start experimenting with different ways of doing things, right? You're not going to get it right, and it's not even going to work the first time, likely, right? Like, but things are changing. They are not steadily changing necessarily. They are not directly in a straight line changing, partially because it's so hard to overcome and shape the system. The same way that a systemic problem like democracy or like an infinite game problem as climate, right? Like it's hard to change the way that we're used to do things. And yet it's necessary that we do what we can to contribute to that change. I'm going to stop there. We are at 10:30 on the dot. I'm very thankful for you to joining. I really hope that this has been helpful, that the tools that are presented here, that the ideas that are here help you in your journey too. We're very close to ending our common journey here with this course. We'll have one more class next week. What I'm going to propose is that we do a class actually that synthesizes the last two topics that we're going to talk about, the future of development and the development professional. Why? Because then what we would like is to concentrate in having the practitioner dialogues in which also we can talk about the future of development and the future of the development profession over time. So hopefully you can join us for our last lecture style session next week, right? Then we're going to focus more on these practitioner dialogues to talk a bit more about the future and how to shape it. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Leah, for moderating the discussion. I'm very thankful for all your attention and your ideas and the comments that you have been sending. So I declare, as usual, class dismissed. Thank you so much. See you next time. See you soon. Take care.